Okay, so let's go into some examples. People generally want to appear knowledgeable and agreeable, even to strangers. How might that affect the results of a telephone survey conducted by a school on the satisfaction of graduates with their education? What biases should we worry about? Well, one thing we want to start off with is the biases that come from sampling methods, right? So, sampling method bias. Would people's desire to appear knowledgeable and agreeable, would that somehow bias this? Well, I think mostly it probably wouldn't affect the sampling method, because the sampling method would be choosing who to call, right? It probably wouldn't affect that, but it may affect the response biases, right? So first, out of sampling or selection bias, versus response bias. So those are the two different kinds of biases two broad kinds of biases we could choose from. It's this desire to appear knowledgeable and agreeable will most likely affect the response biases more than the sampling bias. Sampling, you have the desires of the participant have sort of less to do with it than the desires of the experimenter or researcher. All right, but we are going to have to worry about response bias. So one thing might be is, would this desire affect the non-response bias? Perhaps, because perhaps the people who choose to be choose to actually take part in the telephone survey, those people might be the ones who really, really want to please people, right? So you might get people pleasers overrepresented. And maybe the people who are sort of less social or less agreeable, they would be underrepresented, right? So as for questionnaire bias, perhaps there might be some of that bias, but that would depend mostly on the question and less on the participant themselves. The other thing that we probably do have to worry about is the incorrect responses, right? So people might be like, oh yeah, trying to think back, and when they think back and somebody asks them, oh, like, do you think college really was valuable to you, or how satisfied are you with your educational experience, they might think back and just remember all the good times or their favorite professors, right? And they might forget all their useless professors or classes they thought were so useless they didn't even go up to class, right? So they might incorrectly remember or have a bias in their memories. Or maybe it might just be as simple as, maybe some of them went to like a game or something recently for their school, and so some of that school spirit gets activated, and it may have nothing to do with educational experience, but still color their thoughts about their educational experience, right? So I would say the two biases that we should worry about the most are non-response and incorrect response bias. All right. Example 2. At a meeting of local Democrats, the organizers wanted to estimate how well the party will do in the next election. They used the people at the meeting for their sample. What biases might arise? So already we know that this is going to entail sampling bias, right? So sampling bias is definitely going to be part of it. And so out of the different types of sampling bias, which of these might be involved? Well, size bias is not really a thing here because it's not that bigger people are going to be more represented. It might be bigger donors are more represented, right? Oh, so maybe. bigger donors. So that might be a possibility. But really, the problem is going to be voluntary response bias. The reason is that these people volunteered to come to this meeting, right? So it's definitely the people who are like really caring. Maybe they're extreme Democrats. Maybe they really hate Republicans. Whatever it is, these people are volunteers that are there not randomly, but because that they've really chosen to be there that night. Also, another thing that we see is that this is definitely a convenience sample. They're just taking the people who came to them, right? So it's a convenience sample, certainly. It's not a judgment sample. These people weren't picked for some reason. And definitely they had a inadequate sampling frame, but that sort of goes along with convenience sample. Now, because of these sampling biases, we know that this sample is already biased. Are there any response biases that might be working here in the background? Certainly, there's the non-response bias. All the people who didn't come to the meeting for whatever reason, maybe they are Republicans, maybe they are Democrats, but they're not that into it. Maybe they're independents and they didn't want to go to a meeting for Democrats, even though they were interested in this candidate. So the non-response bias is important to note. Also, there might be incorrect responses because of this bias sample. So they might ask them, oh, do your friends, are your friends going to vote Democrat? And a lot of them might, when they think back, only think about their Democratic friends because they're sort of in this Democratic context, right? And so they might have incorrect responses that stem from poor context. And context is a questionnaire bias. So questionnaire bias is when something about the way that it's asked changes the answer. If an organizer of a Democratic meeting asks a question, maybe these people will be more like, oh, yeah, I'm very, very Democrat, or yeah, I'm very interested, All right, example 3. A news magazine conducted a poll on Americans asking them to agree or disagree with one of two statements. Statement 1, the government should try to balance their budget with both spending cuts and taxes. Statement 2, I would be disappointed if taxes were raised this year. What kind of biases should we worry about? Well, let's break this down real quick. Does it say anything about sampling, right? Doesn't say anything about sampling. We have no idea how they're sampling. So we could pretty much rule out sampling bias because it has nothing about samples here. So we're probably going to be focusing on the response biases. Now, we don't know how they're asking, so we can't really say anything about the non-responses, but it definitely seems like there's questionnaire biases at work here. Because maybe people will say, yeah, government should definitely try to balance their budget, right? So they might say, agree, right? But they might also agree with this statement that they would be disappointed if taxes were raised this year, right? And so people might use this statement to say, look, Americans are in favor of raising taxes as well as spending cuts. And then somebody might use this to say, look, Americans are very against raising taxes because they would be disappointed if taxes were raised this year, right? And so even though people might probably agree with both of these statements, it doesn't necessarily mean that that they're against each other, right? It's not that they're being internally inconsistent or hypocritical. It's mostly because of the way these things are worded. So, of course, we might say, "Oh, the government should try this," right? It's pretty weak. It's not saying like the government has to, right? But also the next statement is pretty weak too. It's just saying, "Oh, I would be disappointed if taxes were raised this year," right? It's not saying, "Oh, I would move to Canada if, taxes were raised this year," or "I would hate my politicians if taxes were raised this year." And so because of the way that these statements are worded, you might be able to push people to sort of agree or disagree with the statements that, with the idea that taxes are bad or taxes are good, right? All right, so questionnaire bias is definitely one. Would there be sort of a incorrect answer bias? Well, not necessarily. If they had worded these differently, people would probably have a different opinion, right? So that's still a questionnaire bias more than an incorrect response bias. So I would say questionnaire bias is the only one here. And finally, in example 4, it says, to estimate how many students in the city have passed the AP statistics test, a researcher posts a message on a website asking local teachers to report how many students took the exam and how many students passed. What kind of biases should we worry about? Well, definitely we know that there's sampling being mentioned here. The way that the researcher is sampling is that they're posting a message on a website and asking local teachers to respond. So there's definitely sampling bias. First of all, it is probably true that these people are only going to do this if they're volunteering. So there's voluntary response bias, right? Also, it's skewed towards people who are going to this website, right? So that's sort of a convenient sample. You're only taking people who happen to come to this website anyway. And let's see. So these are really the two big ones being sort of perpetrated here. But in addition to sampling bias, there's also some response biases at work here. Definitely there's the non-response bias. And that's because there are going to be teachers who aren't reporting anything. Maybe they had 0 students take the AP exam, or maybe they had 0 students who actually passed, and maybe they're ashamed, right? Or it might be that some of these teachers who are quite influential in teaching AP statistics, they might just not be on the website, right? Or maybe they didn't have time to respond. So that's one definite problem. Another problem might be incorrect responses. So maybe some teachers will just misremember how many of their students actually took or passed the exam, or they might have been incorrect for other reasons. They might have just been off for other reasons. So the non-response and the incorrect response bias, that's probably there.